Charles Hazlitt Upham was born on the 21st of September in 1908 in Christchurch, New Zealand, to John and Agatha Upham. He was known to be a shy boy growing up, but was very courteous. Charles wasn't the strongest or the most physical, with one leg said to be shorter than the other. After attending a couple of boarding schools, his father John was disappointed his son didn't want to become a lawyer like himself. Instead, Charles studied at the Agricultural College, where he became really enthralled with farming, leaving with multiple diplomas. While working as a farm manager, he met his future wife Molly in 1935. And in 1937, he worked for the government valuation department before going to study in 1939. With the outbreak of war in 1939, Charles left college, with his professor Eric Hudson writing a letter to the commanding officer of the Burnham military camp. "Dear Sir, a young man by the name of Upham has left college to join your unit. I commend him to your notice, as, unless I'm greatly mistaken, he should be an outstanding soldier." At age 30, Charles Upham was posted to the 20th Canterbury Otago Battalion with 5 years' experience. He was promoted quickly to sergeant, but not before turning down officer training. While in Egypt in 1940, he was finally convinced to attend an officer training unit and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 20th Battalion. In 1941, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force was deployed to Greece to counter the German and Italian forces there. On Crete, Upham led the 20th and 28th Battalions in an attack against a German machine gun position. The attack was sent in, having to cover nearly 3,000 yards with no fire support. With the capture of the first machine gun, Upham moved up alone, eliminating a further 2 machine guns, the last after crawling within 15 yards before throwing in a hand grenade. The division's counterattack ultimately failed once the Germans' air cover turned up, and forcing a retreat, Upham even carrying a wounded man back to friendly lines. With all the confusion, one of his platoons was left behind in the retreat. Upham grabbed a corporal, and they both ran 600 yards through the German-held lines and brought the troops back, not before brassing up 2 Germans on the way there. You can see Charles Upham was very liked by his troops for a very good reason. During the evacuation of Crete, 2 of his platoons were exposed to mortar fire. This resulted in Charles taking a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder. Being a tough Kiwi, he disregarded his wounds and led his men on the retreat. His reward was a bullet wound to the foot. This would only be treated much later back in Egypt. On the 25th of May, his platoon was taking cover on a ridge when they saw a German force approaching their position. With surprise still on their side, he ordered the platoon forward and met the Germans with small arms and grenades, killing over 40 and pushing the rest back. With the Allies struggling to hold their lines against determined German attacks, Charles Upham, wounded and shot, was still in this fight. On one particular fast attack, Upham sent his platoon back under a sergeant and moved himself forward to warn another platoon where they were going to be surrounded. On his way to the stranded platoon, he was fired on by 2 Germans, and falling to the ground pretending to be dead, Upham shot them both as they approached him, so close in fact that the 2 dead Germans fell onto his rifle. On the 30th of May, his platoon was ordered to shift a party of Germans out of a ravine near Company HQ. Placing his troops in positions overlooking the ravine, Upham took up a Bren gun and 2 of his men and exposed himself to enemy fire about 500 yards away from him, to let his men see the German positions as they popped up to shoot at him. For his actions on Crete, his colonel Howard Kippenberger put him forward for the Victoria Cross. Upham was actually dead against this, feeling he hadn't deserved this award. It's hard to see how he didn't deserve it. Shrapnel in his shoulder, shot in the foot, and suffering the whole time with diarrhoea, batten and bruise. It is a sign of his amazing character and humble nature that he was awarded the Victoria Cross on the 14th of October of that year. But Charles Upham wasn't finished yet. November 1941, Charles Upham was left out of the Second Libyan Campaign, and boy was he pissed off about it. However, he played a vital role in rebuilding the battalion after it suffered terrible losses, and he was promoted to captain. In 1942, the New Zealanders were now part of the 8th Army, fighting a defensive war against Rommel and his Afrika Korps. In late June 1942, the New Zealanders were about to be cut off as Rommel was sweeping into Egypt. The decision was made to make a break for the British lines. And on the night of the 27th of June, the now Captain Upham fought with his men in a brutal hand-to-hand fighting with no regard for his own safety. He was throwing grenades at nearly a point-blank range, so close he received shrapnel wounds in both of his arms from his own grenades, but the breakout was successful. The New Zealand division was moved into a defensive line at a small railway town of El Alamein. Ordered to take the high ground south of the town at El Rastad Ridge, the attack went in on the 14th of July, with Upham's company facing 4 machine gun nests and several tanks with many trucks. Upham once again threw himself into the action, personally destroying a truck and a machine gun nest with grenades. He did this while still receiving more wounds. He was shot in the elbow, and that goes along with the fact that he was full of shrapnel in both of his arms. Refusing to leave the battle, he went to the nearest aid post and got patched up as best they could before returning to his men. The following day, the Germans and Italians counterattacked, during which Upham was hit in the leg by shrapnel and was unable to move, and then was captured. An Italian doctor recommended that his leg be amputated, but was told by Upham in no certain terms that that was going to happen, later being treated by a captured Allied doctor. Once strong enough, he was moved to a POW camp, but not being fond of being a prisoner, Charles Upham smashed a hole in his cell's roof that was made of plasterboard. Moving his bed to climb into the hole, he noticed that the ceiling was wired to a second ceiling and couldn't get very far, therefore was recaptured. Once the Italians had surrendered, he was moved to a German POW camp. While his truck was rounding a bend, Upham decided to jump out, breaking his ankle on the fall, but he made it 400 yards before being captured again. While at Weisenberg camp, he decided one day to climb the fence, but got entangled on barbed wire. A German guard pointed his pistol at Upham's entangled head, and all Charles did was calmly light a cigarette in his response. Being a pain in the German's arse, he was moved to Colditz Castle at the end of 1943, Colditz being where high-value escapees were sent. In typical fashion, Charles tried to escape the train he was being taken on. He was only allowed to use the toilet whilst the train was going at high speed, as to stop him jumping out the window. But that's exactly what he did. Hitting the tracks with such force, he knocked himself unconscious. While waking up, he made his way to a nearby orchard, but unfortunately was recaptured. This was his last escape attempt. With Colditz Castle liberated, ending his captivity, Charles Upham joined up with the American unit that had captured the town. Unfortunately, he was not permitted to fight alongside the Americans, with all POWs having to be evacuated back to England. After returning to England, he was reunited with Molly, who was working as a nurse, and they married on June the 20th, 1945. Eventually, they both returned to New Zealand, but he would meet the King before that. King George VI presented Charles Upham with his Victoria Cross on May the 11th, 1945. Charles Upham was also mentioned in dispatches for his many escape attempts. The King would ask, "Well, Captain Upham, tell me, what have you been doing since you've been back here in London?" In which he replied, "Mostly eating, sir." They would share a lovely walk together in St. James's Park. Recommendations came through for Charles Upham to receive a second VC. When the King asked Major General Howard Kippenberger if Upham deserved a second, Kippenberger replied, "I was his brigadier in North Africa, sir, and he did so many brave things. In my respectful opinion, Captain Upham has won the VC several times over. His second VC was nominated by a Colonel Burrows and a General Inglis. These two separate nominations, both for his actions in North Africa, were combined into a single one and then presented to the king. Charles Upham received a bar to his VC, meaning that he'd won 2 Victoria Crosses. He was the third man in history to win 2 Victoria Crosses, the only fighting soldier to win them, as the other 2 were both doctors in the First World War, but nonetheless both brave men. After the war and returning to New Zealand, the community raised £10,000 to buy him a farm, but Charles declined the money, and it was instead used to make the C.H. Upham Scholarship for ex-servicemen to study at Canterbury Agricultural College. He obtained a war rehabilitation loan and bought the farm on Conway Flat, North Canterbury in New Zealand. He was a successful farmer, even with his injuries, but also served on the Board of Governors of Christ's College for nearly 20 years. Charles and Molly had 3 daughters. Charles was said to turn away any visitor who had a German car and made them park it off his land and walk the way to his house. In 1985, he appeared on an episode of This Is Your Life, but in 1994 he was forced to retire and move to Christchurch because of his poor health. The 22nd of November 1994, Charles Upham passed away, surrounded by his family. His funeral at Christchurch Cathedral was conducted with full military honours. The streets of Christchurch were lined by over 5,000 people. In 1995, the New Zealand Navy commissioned the ship HMNZS Charles Upham. Charles Upham also has many streets named after him. With this ends the story of Charles Upham VC Bar. I sit here writing and reading this story in peace because of men like Charles Upham and everybody who participated in the Second World War, with many paying the ultimate sacrifice. 80 years after the victory in Europe, it is our duty to keep remembering these brave men and their sacrifice.